also great to be working with Diana, and very grateful for her invitation. I've come to town with just over 5,000 of my closest friends in the American Planning Association. A few of whom are out in the audience tonight. I'm happy to see them. And many of them are interested in what we're talking about tonight, namely infrastructure and how to pay for it. I've been thinking about this for some time, and it will come up in the course of this panel, but I know some of the panelists, as a result of having been interested in particular regional approaches to dealing with infrastructure around the country. I had the fortune to be in London last month and look at a couple of big projects that are going forward, namely High-Speed Rail 2 and Crossrail. And these are multi-billion pound, long-term, very serious infrastructure projects that happen to have gone through the transition from a Labor government to coalition government without too many hiccups. And I did meet with the Minister of Transport for the current coalition government, as well as the previous Minister of Transport in the Labor government. And I'd have to say there was an equal amount of commitment to moving ahead, even though you might imagine that under conditions of financial austerity and, let's say, some pretty deep differences of opinion about the right approach to government, there was a consistency in their approach to these projects. And it was almost as if it's a natural thing to say, we need infrastructure, we're going to build what we need, and we're going to stay the course. These projects will outlast administrations, they'll outlast governments, and it's really important that we keep moving ahead. I found that kind of refreshing and not entirely lacking in the United States, but a bit more rare than we'd like to see. There has been, in California with their high-speed rail program, an ability to keep moving forward, even again under conditions of great financial austerity, and I'd say very substantial demonstrations of public support to keep moving ahead, again with billions of dollars of support. And that's what it's going to take, because when we're talking about serious infrastructure, it is very expensive and it doesn't happen overnight. More recently in Massachusetts, our own governor proposed an extremely ambitious program to deal both with infrastructure, transport in particular, and education. He's had a somewhat less enthusiastic response from our legislature, but they're moving in the right direction. I didn't check in as of yesterday. There are many distractions in Boston right now, but I would say that he's going to get a good piece of what he's asked for, and that is also encouraging. Well, I would add to this list my response when I heard about what I slightly inaccurately thought of as the Chicago Infrastructure Bank. And I said, well, this is a terrific idea. And I think the very earliest version of the story I heard suggested something like hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank. So that's a very good thing, and it's very exciting. And sure, but then, of course, I got educated, and we did have a little bit of preparation for this this evening, and I learned a little bit more about the infrastructure trust. We're all going to learn more about it now, but we're going to start this with, it's going to be a show in 4 acts, and I just want you to know the 4th act is going to be you. We're going to reserve a good piece of time at the end for you to tell us what you think. So don't be nervous, you'll get a chance, be patient. But the first act is called It's Not a Great Big Pile of Money. If it's not that, what is it? And I'm going to start with Lois Scott. She's the Chief Financial Officer of the City of Chicago, and she will not shy away from being called the architect of the infrastructure trust. So what is it if not a big pile of money?
Well, before I get to that exact question, is my mic on? Okay, thank you. I think it's really significant that we're here today talking about infrastructure and the health of our cities in the aftermath of what happened yesterday. I mean, it's really, truly extraordinary the way our community comes together, our society as Americans, that we come together during these times. And it makes me think back to Chicago's own history. Just 30 years after Chicago was founded, our city essentially burned down. We lost 1/3 of all the value of the entire city. We lost one in three people was left homeless. within a year, $50 million, this was back in the 1800s, within a year, $50 million of infrastructure investments had been made. Within 9 years, there were 10,000 building permits. And by the turn of the century, the 5th largest city in the world was Chicago. Not Beijing, not Mexico City, not all the cities that we think of as these massive cities, but the city of Chicago is the 5th largest. And it's a testament to the planning, the role of infrastructure, how to rebuild a society, how to really focus on it. And when you do focus on it, what you can accomplish in a very short period of time. So when Mayor Emanuel came into office, May 16th of 2011, a day we chose to live in my heart forever, I joined him on that path to really focus on what the future of Chicago was going to be. And as a CFO, I really look at challenges in 3 different areas. The first that I have to deal with every day is the operating deficits, the operating challenges. Do we have enough money to pay this year's bills? And that gets a lot of media attention, a lot. The second area that I have to spend a lot of time focusing on is the deficit in the long-term legacy liabilities that we as a government, we as taxpayers and citizens of this city have inherited. Those are our pension obligations and our long-term debt that really are a very significant long-term shadow. But even bigger than that deficit long-term is our deficit in infrastructure. And our deficit in infrastructure is something it's one of those sleeping giants out there. It's the quality of the roads we drive on that sometimes have more potholes than they should. It's the train stops on the CTA, where those stops open and close. Do they have the elevators that our society needs? And it's also the future infrastructure. What about broadband? What about the technologies of the future? And how do we actually mastermind a plan on infrastructure to really keep our Chicago at the economic center of the Midwest and as one of the major cities in the world? How do we do that? So the mayor outlined, along with a lot of us, a $7.2 billion capital campaign over 3 years. It's a 30,000 job effort to really focus on infrastructure. Most of that will be done in the conventional ways, with long-term borrowing and with tax revenues. But we also looked around to the needs of the city and we said, if we continue just to put all of this risk on our tax base, all this risk on our taxpayers, and hope that the federal government and the state will have grants for us, we are never going to advance the ball in the city of Chicago. We have to make sure that we're remaining open to all sorts of ideas. So with that was born the idea of creating a Chicago infrastructure trust. We toyed with calling it a bank at one time. But you know, it's been talked about nationwide about what are we doing with the National Infrastructure Bank, what are we doing at different models in Virginia, the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange. There's a lot going on in this topic, but what are the models? And while I know for certain that what we created at the beginning will morph over time, we as a society really have to create a laboratory of a lot of different models because the need is so huge, and we have to try and be innovative in thinking about this long-term deficit that we as a society have. So the Chicago Infrastructure Trust, the architect really is Mayor Emanuel. He likes to call himself the father of the trust, and I can't say I'm the mother because it freaks out my husband. But I would call myself the midwife. So I helped give birth along with other people in the room here tonight.
Architects often have to step back a little bit.
So the Chicago Infrastructure Trust is a nonprofit organization created by City Council. It has a 5-member board of directors appointed by the mayor, and they serve for staggered terms. Mayor appoints, and then they kind of take on their own life. So we're at the point where our child has been born, and we have to let our child somewhat now move forward and really take on its life. So the Chicago Infrastructure Trust was born last year. The goal and the mission is to do transformative projects in new ways that bring together all of the capital resources of our economy, of our society, of our world, to really help look at infrastructure needs in Chicago. When I had the privilege of sitting in front of City Council for, I believe it was 9 hours, without a bathroom break, some of you were in the audience that day, and asking a few questions, I got a lot of questions about what we were doing and why we weren't just using tax-exempt financing. And I said, isn't tax-exempt financing always cheaper? And I said, well, I've been in finance 31 years of my professional career, and tax-exempt financing is cheaper not just because of the tax code, but because of risk. And in a tax-exempt bond transaction, we take all of the project risk and we assign it to the people in this room, the taxpayer. If the technology is incorrect, oh well, we'll go borrow more and just tax for it. If we have cost overruns, well, we can try and have a guaranteed max price contract, but if we designed it wrong and we're out of that scope, we'll just borrow more and it's on the tax base. So what people misconceive when they look at tax-exempt financing, they confuse the rate with the risk. Rates are low because risk is low. Rates are higher when risk is higher. So if we were taking and transferring some of the risk, there might be a little bit higher borrowing cost, but the risk would not be on the taxpayer. And so we have to begin thinking as a community, that the educated people in this room need to begin thinking not just in terms of the absolute cost, but what is the risk-adjusted cost and the life cycle costs? Because governments are great at building things and not at keeping and maintaining them with the caliber. Everybody in this room is going to chuckle when I say that because we all know it to be true. But we need new models and new systems of accountability. So the trust is an attempt, and it will definitely morph, but the trust is our attempt to say to the world, our hand is in the air, that we are not going to rest on the old ways of doing business, that we're going to keep open-minded. We're going to bring together all of the accountability that the public has demanded, and I think there are people in this room that would testify that the trust, which is of concern to people, still complies with FOIA, still complies with open meetings. All of the information is online, and there's greater public input there than in any of the tax-exempt bond deals I ever do. So I'll leave it there because I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, but that's kind of a quick overview of the infrastructure trust here in Chicago.
Thank you very much, Lois. We're now going to turn to MarySue Barrett, who is president of Metropolitan Planning Council, somebody who I have known for some time in that capacity, and I think she can, as a member of the board of the trust, can share her perspective and maybe give a little bit of a planning spin as well.
Sure. So I'm on the advisory board of the Chicago Infrastructure Trust. It complements the 5-member governing board, and we've been brought on to bring in additional expertise, which one of the things I hope to bring is knowledge of best practices around the world and around the country, as well as this emphasis on transparency. I want to emphasize Lois's excellent explanation of the risk-reward continuum. You know, we're looking to find that right mix that makes sense. The Chicago Infrastructure Trust has received just a huge amount of attention globally. Delegations from China coming to hear about what the trust has done. Of course, the trust is just getting organized. So as I've joined the advisory board, one of the first jobs is just getting the business practices, hiring an executive director who's been on board all of a month and a half. So as you can tell, this is really at its nascent stage. But I think it's gotten a lot of attention because of its potential to aggregate projects of a variety of types, we'll talk about that, and find that balance of risk and rewards that could, based on the whole continuum of what you could have a private entity provide, design it, build it, operate it, maintain it, finance it, you can draw from that continuum of that menu of options and say, well, I want this, and I want this piece, and let's see what that looks like. It's not a formulaic piece, but what does have to be standardized is the procedures. That's the only way you can squeeze efficiencies out of this. So among the things that are being looked at by the board right now is a procurement model. Other countries that we might look to that have a lot more experience on innovative infrastructure financing tools, Canada, and even some states in the US, what they have standardized is their procurement process. So there's certainty, there's predictability, as opposed to a deal-by-deal basis. So in Chicago, all of us are familiar with some early projects that were viewed as groundbreaking, like the Skyway deal. And then there's, as this article from Next City that was published yesterday has a great analogy of the shadow overhanging in the shape of a parking meter. I love that visual. And that's exactly what it feels like. I mean, we really, literally cannot have a discussion without thinking of the parking meter deal, which I'll remind us as a planning person who's also a transit junkie, what I loved about the very earliest iterations of this parking meter private contracting option was that we understood there was going to be a trade-off. And the original proposal as part of a federal initiative for injecting innovation into cities was we would charge more for parking in certain areas like the downtown, and use the additional proceeds to expand transit options. So to pay for more rapid bus and other alternatives, enhancements to our transit system. Using one-time infusion of capital for capital infrastructure for this backlog that Lois talked about. And then, of course, the recession hit, and a prior administration decided to use a good portion of the proceeds for closing a budget gap. We've all learned those lessons. We're not, we're open-eyed about that, but we want to put it on the table to say we know the mistakes of the past. We want to make sure we don't make those mistakes in the future. But I think as every other place around the country is also under this shadow in the shape of a parking meter, we know that we have an obligation here in Chicago to set a new prototype. So that is a very sobering expectation that we're all collectively, civically, governmentally taking on. And I'm optimistic that with Mayor Emanuel's driving pressure to make sure that this is a solution for the city as well as a prototype for others elsewhere, that the Chicago retrofit projects, which are first out of the gate, and other projects in the future can benefit from this kind of standardization. And looking at this as one tool to deploy. It'll be a tool we haven't had before, but it's not going to be the only way that projects are financed in the future. It'll be an alternative we didn't have in the past.
Thank you, MarySue, for that perspective. And now on to Roy Kienitz, who's had a distinguished career in state and federal transportation policy, most recently in Washington. He's familiar with the typologies. He helped me to understand that this is one of a whole series of species of trusts and banks. And maybe you could sort of give it its place in the world of trusts and banks.
Well, thank you. Before I do that, I just wanted to make one comment. You did mention the high-speed rail program in England and that you had met with the prior transport minister. And I just want to say that the Secretary of Transport in the prior Labour government has the best name of anyone I've ever dealt with.
But it's not pronounced the way it is.
I know, but his name is Lord Adonis. And it turns out he says it Adonis, and he's sort of a skinny guy. First time I saw that, just go with it. So yeah, I've been involved. I spent a good year of my life, along with several other people in this room, trying to do a very, very large P3 deal in Pennsylvania involving the leasing Pennsylvania Turnpike, which sadly did not go through. Although we got a wonderful bid for $12.8 billion, which we were not able to cash. And then I've been involved for 20 years in almost all the different efforts to try to create infrastructure banks at the federal level and in some states as well. And I think one of the principal things that anyone who wants to get involved in this business should understand about that is that the term infrastructure bank or infrastructure trust has no fixed meaning, right? So you and I could have a conversation about that, and we'd both be nodding and smiling, and we would have totally different ideas about what we were talking about, since it's a term that has never actually been defined. When some people say infrastructure bank, what they think it means is the government will take a bunch of money, give it to some small group of people, and that group of people can figure out who gets it, and they hope to get paid back someday. They might not. So that's a form of allocating government subsidy. Now maybe you would use different methods to allocate that subsidy we use now. You might use business principles, and you might use bid practices and private sector delivery and all of those things. But fundamentally what you're doing is taking taxpayer dollars and allocating them to uses, which in our infrastructure business is a fair thing, because there's lots of infrastructure projects out there which we love and benefit us, which do not generate enough revenue to pay for themselves. The CTA is a wonderful system. Last time I checked, it runs a bit of a deficit, right? As with every other transit system in the world, except Hong Kong, I believe, where the transit system actually makes money. Another meaning for an infrastructure bank is it's an intermediary. It aggregates money from the private sector looking to make a return on their investment on one side, and it aggregates project ideas from the public sector, and it tries to make a marriage in the middle. And you can do this either on a project-by-project basis. Let's define a particular project, how people will get paid back, find a private sector partner, find a government partner, marry them up, do the deal, shake hands, go on to the next one. Or there are some thoughts that these can be done on an aggregated basis. I will go to 10 different investors, and they will each give me $10 quadrillion, and I'll put them in the giant pile, and I will $100 quadrillion, and I'll go out and find 100 projects. And So everyone who's trying to do this, Chicago is furthest along. New York State, Governor Cuomo is now wrestling with this exact same problem. There are 4 or 5 different bills in Congress that are trying to do it. Any one of these flavors could work. But it's basically like they're all trying to build a key, but they're all trying to pick the same lock. And the lock they're trying to pick is a lot of need, a culture of having the taxpayer pay for it. We don't really ask the users of the thing to pay very much for it. And the term that I learned in my Pennsylvania days is a strong asymmetry between the private sector knowledge and public sector knowledge. It is almost universally true that for every private sector infrastructure you're trying to do, the people sitting across the table from the private sector are experts. They have done this before. They have been around the block 4 or 5 times. They know what they're doing. The people from the public sector have never done this before. They are smart people, but they are learning as they go. And I can say this because that was me several years ago. I didn't know what I was doing, but I'm a quick learner, I hope. And so the thing that an institutional structure can do really well, hopefully, is handle this asymmetry of information and expertise so that you create standardization, you create models, you create fixed expectations, and it's not just give the private sector a reliable partner to deal with. That's part of what you want to do. But a lot of what you want to do is teach the elected and appointed leaders in the public sector what it is they should expect. Because unfortunately, what a lot of them come in wanting is, I want something for nothing. What's not to like about something for nothing? We all want that, right? But the private sector is pretty good at saying no to that. The private sector is very good at saying something for something. I will take on a certain amount of risk. I will help control construction costs. I will be ruthless with the number of hours my employees are spending on this. If people aren't performing, I will fire them. All things that the public sector sometimes struggles to do. But in return for that, I'm not in this to, for the forgotten country. We're in this to make money for our investors, and so let's negotiate what a reasonable terms are for that. And not all infrastructure is well attuned to that. In the world of water, drinking water, wastewater, there is a culture in the United States of people get a water bill. It's a routine thing. You get it quarterly, whatever. People are used to paying it. So the question is not, can you go from getting no bill to getting a bill? Well, that's elected officials tend to blanch at that. But you go from getting a bill that's $150, and maybe it'll now be $175, but we'll be getting one. So that's a world where there has been some success in the public-private world. Toll roads, you're already paying. The only question is how much are you paying? Public transportation, yes, although we rarely charge enough, and you probably couldn't charge enough to make it profitable. But once again, you can bring the private sector expertise in managing projects, delivering on time, operations and design. In the best case scenario, I think one of the most interesting projects I know of is the just newly opened high occupancy / toll lanes built on the Washington Beltway in Virginia. So I got involved with this project, 4 jobs ago, when the staff for the Virginia Department of Transportation was asked by the leadership to go design a project to widen this section of highway and make the widened lanes tolls. And they came back and told the leadership that they had designed a $2.2 billion project to do just this, that would tear down 350 houses. All right, can you guys please get us the money and we'll start tomorrow. And for a variety of reasons, one of which is they didn't have the money, the second of which is the outcry from this community. As you might imagine, like back in the day, you could maybe, Robert Moses did that, but like when was the last time someone tore down 350 homes to build a highway project? It's just, that does not sell it. A group of private sector guys got a hold of this, and they sat around a conference table one day and said, we could do a better job. They went and designed a project which delivers the exact same utility for half the money, and they took like 12 homes. That is an example of the public sector and the private sector are good at different things, and in this case, the private sector, they're going to get compensated. They're now partnering in this project. They've signed a big deal. They've put some of their own money in. They're going to keep the toll revenue for 30 or 50 years, I can't remember what the length of the deal was, then, you know, they're going to make money. But the amount of money they're going to make is way less than the amount of money they saved you by delivering you a fundamentally better product. If that is like the epitome of the kind of deal we want to do here, is to use the private sector to do what they can be very good at, but not every deal that walks in the door is a good deal. And that's something that hopefully that the folks at the Trust are going to be spending their time trying to figure out how do you parse those differences. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. Now on to Rita Athas, who's president of the World Business Chicago Group and in the business of economic development. And she's going to comment on what's in this for economic development. How is the Trust going to advance economic development jobs in Chicago?
Thank you. You know, I'm taking obviously a different approach to this. First of all, let me say that, you know, our job at World Business Chicago is to sell and market the city of Chicago to businesses, to have them locate or stay here. And I always say I have the best product in the world to sell. But given that, part of that is the infrastructure that's that product. And let me go through some of the reasons people do come to Chicago. Number one is location. And location has an awful lot to do with the transportation that's available here in the city. So the airport system is our number one draw. I think all of you know, if you live here, we have 2,900 flights, 200 direct flights. So let me just give you an example. Hopefully last week or the week before, you read that a mining company from Idaho called Coeur d'Alene picked up from Idaho and came here to Chicago and put their headquarters here. I went on the internet and looked up Coeur d'Alene, one of the 10 prettiest cities in the country. I'm like, oh, why do you know? Why? The reason was that, like so many companies, they're global now. And their mines are in South America and they're in Asia. And their executives were driving an hour and 15 minutes to the airport and then getting on a plane that was not a nonstop, and then having to go from one airport to the other. The amount of time that it was taking was a real disadvantage to them, and so our infrastructure was what really helped pull them there. Same thing as you know with our freight. Almost half of all freight comes through Chicago. That means a number of our businesses are dependent on that or grow with that. Extremely important to us. The second reason people come here, and it's becoming more and more prevalent, is our workforce, and especially those 25 to 34-year-olds who I think all live in Wrigleyville. I think you've been here, you know what that's like. But they're a real draw for companies. That age group is different from my age group, in that 50% of them don't own cars, and they don't intend to own cars. They want a transportation system, and even though the CTA has its challenges, we are one of the few major global cities with a transportation system like the one we have, the transit system. 1.7 million passengers a day, bigger than the entire city of Philadelphia. And I think sometimes we don't think about just the impact that has. They're also very much into leisure, and so you need all the infrastructure along the lakefront. I have the advantage of living in the condo that overlooks the lake. When I look out there in the morning and see the runners and the bicyclists and everyone, it's a real draw. That quality of life is a real draw, and from an economic development standpoint, having that workforce certainly helps us bring in companies. And then there's the direct dollar impact, and probably one of the best examples is what you're sitting across from, which is Millennium Park, which I don't think anybody anticipated in the beginning the economic draw that would be. In 2005, the numbers on that were that it generated $570 million. I would love to know what that number is today. If you see the restaurants and if you see the buildings that have gone up and all the people that work in those buildings, so, you know, there's kind of the intangibles, but then there's the very tangible of why I want this trust to work and for you to get all that money and we start spending it right away.
Thank you for that, Rita. I'm impressed that the trust, which is quite new, is already in business and has put out requests for proposals and is in the process of evaluating potential projects. I understand they're all in the realm of retrofitting buildings for energy efficiency. And I'm going to ask Lois to give us a bit more of the concrete aspect of these real potential projects, the way that the process is working, and then I'll draw out the panel on the other kinds of things that might be funded through the trust.
So Retrofit Chicago will be the first project that we hope that the trust will give favorable consideration to with the city. Hopefully we can encourage that. Retrofit Chicago is approximately a $200 million effort. We will make improvements to Chicago buildings and these, like light bulbs, windows, roofs, etc. And the savings and energy costs associated with putting those improvements in place, those savings will actually pay for the full cost of putting the capital in there. We expect to retrofit a couple hundred Chicago public school buildings. Might be small projects in each building that independently would not get done. So if you had a $25,000 project for a school, on the overall agenda, it's not happening because it just takes just as much time to do that as it does to do a $100 million project. So we're going to aggregate those smaller projects for Chicago public schools, for our police stations, our firehouses, etc., as well as the pumping stations for our water system, which are presently steam operated, and converting those to electric will actually save a tremendous amount of energy costs as well as money. And we're going to aggregate across the different governmental entities and departments and pull that together into a common plan of finance. The trust sent out a request for qualifications, which received about, I don't know, up to 14 responses from all different types of investors. Exactly what we were hoping that the trust would generate is from different types of investors. So it is not just lenders, it is not just banks and people who want tax-exempt financing, but it is international players, green investors, very new, the charitable world we hope will come in, labor, that see that there are opportunities to create jobs and are trying to align their investments with those types of opportunities. So we'll open up a bigger box of types of investors, and the trust and its advisory team will be working with the city to optimize what the right structure is before it gets a final bid. But we're very hopeful that we can get borrowing costs in the very, very low single digits and really open up hundreds of millions of dollars of improvements into our city infrastructure without costing taxpayers a dime. In fact, putting money back into the taxpayers' pockets, the savings that are generated over time. That will be the first project, and then from there we'll see how the trust board and its advisory team want to shape and bring forward additional projects as we go on.
Very good. So MarySue, you're familiar with the 12 plants in Chicago and all of the fields that might be implicated here, from transport to wastewater, and on the advisory board. Tell us a bit about what you think the kinds of projects might be in the future that could be funded under this trust.
So Lois just used the Retrofit Chicago first model out of the box as an example of aggregating projects and putting it out there and seeing what teams, a variety of backgrounds of team members come forth. Those ideas of projects can come from the private sector of here's a cost saving, here's something we can do more efficiently. They can also come from the public agencies themselves, and they can come from the public. I think the great part of the commitment to transparency is that that will be an ongoing piece of our business, of evaluating ideas. As part of the early work of the Infrastructure Trust, I mentioned the executive director was just recently hired, Steve Beitler, and he, as you can imagine, is making the rounds for a lot of meetings, and so knocked on the door of the city departments, individually, in groups, in the city agencies, and kept on stumbling across these plans. Now here's a guy who's been in the federal government a long time ago, but mostly his career in the private sector, never in municipal government. And his attitude was, someone should be shocked, because there's all these plans, and at some point when he was inventorying them, I think he had 8 or 9 on his list, and I glanced at the list and said, there's a few more. And so there's at least 12. These are City of Chicago department plans. Some of them are overarching, like the new Sustainable Chicago Plan, which aggregates all of the green initiatives across a variety of areas. Some of them are topical, like industrial corridors, or Chicago River, or Central Area, which is a massive dollar amount plan. And they do they do cross-reference each other somewhat, but they're standalone plans. And then there's our regional plan. We have a Go to 2040 plan that is the region's adopted plan, which includes Chicago projects, but Chicago operates economically within a regional context. So the airport and the access from all points to different employment corridors is one of the things that makes our loop work well, is that we're part of a greater networked region. So, you know, these plans need to inform the work, but it's not as simple as opening up the table of contents and looking down the list and saying, oh, this is the next one that the infrastructure trust can do. It has to be aligned with this model. So the aggregation of smaller projects to a scale. I think we're going to learn some really interesting things about what is the scale that is necessary to generate the private sector interest and to make the cost of private capital within the competitive range. Energy efficiency retrofits, you can see across a whole host of government agencies how a number of small projects can be aggregated to a scale of interest. Another project which is being talked about is to look at solar power or wind power on vacant parcels in the city. Transit, water, stormwater. I mean, each of these projects, you pick up any one of those 12, has a number of options, but it has to be ones that can come to a scale to make the efficiency of the private sector delivery. If a bidder can figure out a way to lower the cost, I think Roy's example was an excellent one. Boy, we can do that. We can figure out a way to design this at a lower cost, which then kind of washes out the differential on financing. So, you know, we'll see what's next out of the box, but anything is fair game. The 12 plans are not the only source of project ideas, but they are an important source.
Let me just add one thing to that, and that is, I think the trust received its first proposal from a member of the public at its most recent board meeting. So there's opportunities for us all to get involved in rebuilding our own city.
Absolutely. I'm going to come back to MarySue in a little while on a sort of big regional question, but let's open it up. Other kinds of projects?
I would actually want to make one comment on the energy efficiency thing. I think that's a great place to start because in my experience of trying to do energy efficiency retrofits, there is a real market failure. There is a group of companies out there that like to call themselves energy service companies, and their pitch to you is, show me your building project, whatever it is, give me all your data about its energy use, I'll go in and do an inventory, and then I will go make it more efficient, and you and I will split the savings. I'll put in the capital will be repaid over time, you know, and your bill will eventually go down, you make money, I make money, it's a great deal. And so when I was in state government, we tried to do one of these deals. We had a giant complex in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that runs off like this horrible old steam plant. It's like the exact, you know, thing. And we got a bunch of companies in there, we started doing this work, and what we found out is that the data that describes how much energy is being used was so bad that neither the public sector nor the private sector were willing to make a binding ironclad deal about who would pay for what on the basis of terrible data. And since doing that, I've been involved in 2 other deals where that turned out to be the problem. If you try to go do a one-off project, it's so much work for both sides to define the baseline that it's more work to figure out how to do it than the benefit you get out of doing the project. But if you aggregate and you bundle projects, your numbers are going to be off on each individual project. But if you're doing 100 of them and you're doing it as a bundle, and the perfect role for the trust is basically to stand in the middle of that deal and say, private sector is going to have some upside, the public is going to have some upside, and there's some uncertainty in there. We can own the uncertainty. And that way, neither side freaks out and walks away from the table because there's someone in the middle whose job it is to sort of solve that market failure. And then the question is, can we find examples of that in other areas? And water savings is potentially one of them. Delivering water to people who waste it or not metering it correctly, you know, costs money. And so there's money to be saved by doing that more efficiently as well.
Okay, we're going to be opening up this whole idea of the kinds of projects to the panel, to the whole audience. But let's stay with the panel. Rita, yes, what would you suggest?
I just wanted to comment, you know, there's so much need. I mean, we think about all the need in the city. But again, from an economic development standpoint, we just recently, Mayor Emanuel Has in Chicago to do a plan for economic growth and jobs. And in doing that plan, McKinsey pointed out that Chicago, the Chicago area, is going to be the only mega city in the next several decades in North America, the only new mega city. Now what that means is we're the gateway to the entire Midwest. And that's the way that we, compete in the global world, we sell all the things that we're doing, and you need the infrastructure to tie that together. So it's trying to find the funding not only for the city, but how do you attach the city to this larger megawatt region, as we go forward.
I'm happy you mentioned big regions. It's one of my sort of hobbies. We'll come back to that, I think, call them mega regions. Well, MarySue, do you want to comment on how the Chicago Infrastructure Trust might be a model or prototype for a regional effort in the Chicago area? Because as I've been educated, the trust works in the city of Chicago, doesn't work outside by charter.
Its charge is within the city limits, but I work for an organization, the Metropolitan Planning Council, that is non-governmental and that we work across city and suburb. And one of the entities we work with is the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. Rita was instrumental in getting that entity off the ground under Mayor Daley's administration, and it's continued to provide this huge value of acting together. So if you think about applying that to infrastructure needs, I think there are some potential near-term opportunities. We've got 274 municipalities outside of the city of Chicago in the 6-county region. So we are more atomized than any other place in the country. I think Illinois and Pennsylvania, kind of duke it out for
2,700 units of local government.
More units of local government. We create them. We don't ever abolish them. It's a huge problem. It's an inefficiency that becomes much more painfully obvious in a down economy. So it is difficult to eliminate these things, and so one of the strategies we've been involved with is intergovernmental cooperation as informal overlay agreement. So we've all known of these entities that exist for things like police and ambulance services, sometimes recycling and other operational services of municipalities. What has not been done is infrastructure and development and investment across. Why? Because they've got separate taxing structures and they view themselves as competing against my auto dealership and your shopping mall, right? We're fighting against each other for what goes where. In this economy, in this global environment, we're interdependent, and there's a growing recognition that no community can fund it on their own. So this idea of aggregation that the Chicago Infrastructure Trust is deploying and just beginning to learn from is very intriguing to me. I have heard different numbers from private finance experts about what is the threshold amount that makes, that's the kind of trigger for interest from the private sector, 250 million, and others I've heard as low as 150 million. So again, we're going to learn about what that threshold is, but there are very few projects in an individual suburb that are going to be in the $100 million range. But you can see an aggregation of a transportation corridor that crosses over multiple jurisdictions, or joint water utilities. They're separate now, that's an inefficient operational structure. So as communities are kind of over the barrel, looking for solutions, they've got the same sort of pension and operating budget pressures that Lois struggles with on a daily basis, and they have to modernize their infrastructure. So I think the Chicago Infrastructure Trust is well-positioned to help other major cities and even our own backyard learn from how this tool, it would look different, but how it might be deployed within some of the other areas. The structure for how that would come about, I don't think have been invented yet, but that's intriguing as well.
Very exciting. Let me stay with this for a second, just on the project level, and Roy or others. What would, apart from the energy retrofit, which I understand, what would the best kinds of projects be? I mean, what would the characteristics be of those projects?
Well, I can give you a catalog of recent examples. One of the most recent privatization deals that got done was, what's the name of the airport in San Juan? Jose Marin International Airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which is, if any of you have flown in and out of the airport, The airport side of that airport is an international airport like any other. The passenger sort of land side of that airport is not up to modern standards. And so the governor of Puerto Rico helped do a deal where that the operation and capital of the sort of passenger serving side of that, the counters, the kiosks, the parking, the retail, all of that has been turned over to a private contractor, and their goal is to come in and turn it into a beautiful, attractive, interesting, lots of retail stores, lots of opportunities to spend money on God knows what, and that will be good for the private partner, and that will be good for the community as well. I think in part there was a perception that the management of that facility was not going to undertake that work if left to their own devices, and if they did, they would not do it up to the standard that people expect in international airports around the world. And so that was solving a very particular problem that existed in that particular place. And if there's one lesson there, it's that there's a lot of similarities, but each deal is its own deal. You can create similar structures and contracting norms, but each deal is really motivated by the circumstances that exist around it. Another one was recently in Maryland. They have done a small deal, which I think was less than $100 million, to privatize the rest stops along Interstate 95 that are operated by the state of Maryland. Once again, any individual highway rest area, these sort of old, kind of not particularly wonderful bathroom facilities and not much else sort of places. They're going to turn them into big, beautiful events, big, beautiful facilities with lots of opportunities to spend money. The private sector will keep the benefit, and the state will get the benefit of, they were looking at these old facilities which are falling apart and needed capital investment. They didn't have any money in their capital program to do it, so they'll turn it over, and the private sector thought, hey, if we do a good job, we can make money on this. So they come in all sorts of flavors, and the final one I would say is they're the first really major P3 public transit deal was recently inked in Denver, whereby they're building a whole transit line all the way from Denver International Airport to downtown, out to the western suburbs. It's a multi-billion-dollar project, and the private partner will do all of the construction, all of the maintenance, and the operation. They will be responsible for any cost overruns in construction, and they get the benefit of any upside in increased ridership by delivering excellent service. They're in a partnership with the government to plan for transit-oriented development around the stations. The private partner has every incentive to try to have more people live at their stations, so there's more traffic and more revenue for them. Now that's a cash negative deal for the government. It's transit. Transit's not a moneymaker on the narrow accounting of the project. So the bids were not, how much do I, the government, get to let you build this project? It was, how much per year am I going to pay you to build this project? Instead of putting up the cash myself, I'll give you an equal payment of X dollars per year over 30 years, and whoever's handed in the envelope with X being the lowest number got the deal. So that's one of those cases where the optics around the deal so far have been really good, but they haven't opened it yet. No one has written it yet, so we don't really know. But you can bring this technique to almost any area, but they're not all money makers. Some of them are simply containing your losses, as it were, or your investment.
In cases like the Denver transit line, Roy, have people considered trying to capture some of the value from stationary development and rising land value as a part of the financial deal, which is, in other countries, this is the way the transits are.
Yeah, I remember being in Japan, and the Japan Rail Central owned a piece of property at the Nagoya train station. They were putting in a high-speed rail there, and they said, we wanted to bring more development to this site and capture value. So they built 2 giant office buildings and filled them up with staff, except all of the staff worked for Japan Rail, like 16,000 people in these 2 office buildings. And what that really points to is that is a great idea in theory, and it tends to be really hard to do in practice, because if you own the land, you're building the transit line, you control the zoning, and you can have land zoned for low density use that you own, you're going to build a transit line in there, and you can make a deal with a developer to upzone the land, share the value, all of that. Almost every case, those are 3 different people. There's one zoning authority, there's a different landowner, and the project developer is a 3rd person. If you happen to bring in your project at a time when the economy's down, the developers are like, hey, in 5 years, I'd love to do the project, but I'm not going to do it today. Or the local municipality has NIMBY problems and they don't want the density. So it's a great idea in theory, but it's often hard to implement.
I think about Chicago, you might have the zoning, you might have the project, and, you know, you might.
Answer that question a little bit differently? I hope that the Infrastructure Trust and the other laboratories, petri dishes that are out there on this topic, I hope they do something that none of the people in this room have thought of yet, or haven't explored yet. Over spring break, I had the opportunity to go see the Hoover Dam. I'd never been to the Hoover Dam, heard about it my whole life. Did you know it was a public-private partnership? Did you know it was paid for entirely with private dollars? People think that this is a new concept. It wasn't. It was built, it was supposed to take 6 years to build, it ended up taking 4. It was supposed to cost $60 million to build, it ended up costing $48 million. But it's something new, something that nobody had ever dreamt of before, to actually bring water to a major part of the American public. I always use the example, and if you've heard it before, I apologize, but it's really profound, and that is New York City subway. Can you imagine New York City without the subway system? And yet that was privately funded. It was funded because the private sector is willing to take the risk on electricity, whether it was alternating current or direct current. And the public sector would have spent the next 10 years trying to figure out which it was going to be. So I hope that some of the things the trust does are ideas and infrastructure that will fuel things in totally different ways that haven't really been fully explored before. And I hope that the trust will serve a role in exploring transformative, really new ideas with our community as well.
MarySue, do you want to go on the
Well,
value capture?
kind of on both these points, the examples that you cite from Denver on the Fast Track's new transit line, I'd also turn to Denver on their Union Station redevelopment, which is under construction. This tool called value capture, where in this case the city did own a major parcel adjacent to the planned station that has both commuter rail, local transit, and intercity Amtrak transportation. So it's a multimodal location, and for them to be able to build a major office tower and then capture that increment to fund in part infrastructure. You know, these are tools that transit districts like Metro in Washington D.C. area and the Maryland and Virginia suburbs have done forever. We think that that's almost a radical idea when you think about our region. We've got very historical transit-oriented development. We don't even recognize it is that in the city of Chicago. It's just, you know, there's a lot of retail around our CTA rail stations, right? It's always been there, but it hasn't been deliberate. In the case of Metro, they've never engaged fully in the real estate development opportunities around our suburban rail stations, and so missed an opportunity other than parking. And even there, a lot of it's just surface parking, right, instead of parking structures with other amenities that riders want. So there's not so new lessons to be learned from other places. The Infrastructure Trust could deploy these tools, but also there might be times when the city looks at this and says, you know what, here's the 2 pathways we can go down, and this tool might actually go with a general obligation bond financing tool. So it becomes a vetting process. Yes, hopefully for these great, boy, we never evaluated that type of options that Lois talks about.
So we're kind of leading up to Act 3, which is aspirational. What do we really hope for? What might be something we're a little worried about in terms of the trust? If we transport ourselves 20 years into the future and look back, what would our fondest dreams be for the accomplishments of the Chicago Infrastructure Trust? And where might we be concerned that it could go off the rails a bit? And I'll just go down the line. Lois?
Well, I think I will go back to one of the points I made early on, and that's that the trust is just a small part of our infrastructure needs. And so I would think that I would hope, my aspiration would be that the Infrastructure Trust has financed half dozen, a dozen, 20 projects that are transformational. That is not routine repair of our roads necessarily, or maybe even the rebuild of a CTA transit station, but rather done something very new and powerful, maybe with technology in ways that because it's changing so quickly, that we have to fuel that future economy. I would hope it would be a creator of jobs. I would hope it would be a multiplier of economic activity for our city. And I hope that it would play a role in positioning Chicago for long-term economic health. Because I think that we forget how fragile economies can be. And I think Greece is a perfect example of how quickly things can erode And it spirals very, very quickly. And we need to do everything we can as a community to really keep our economy healthy and at the forefront. And that does require balanced budgets. It does require us to deal with our long-term liabilities and figure out how we're going to get this infrastructure to fuel that future economy. It's not just jobs today with the shovels in the ground. It is jobs in the future because we can attract the workforce that we need and we can serve that workforce and serve that community of people with good schools and transit, et cetera. So I hope it would play a role in the long-term economic health of the region.
I agree with that transformational impact. I'm going to take a little different twist on that. I think we would all agree that we're not looking for the trust to do the projects that the financial bidders are interested in. They're the projects that are going to have the greatest economic value to the city. So one of the byproducts of doing good projects is institutionalizing that way of thinking. And I think that would be such a huge asset. We've, for so long, been subject to projects that move to the front of the pack because of who asks, or someone has an idea that hasn't been fully vetted, and it turns out that it doesn't have as much economic value. So this brings a discipline to the evaluation projects of bang for the buck, return on investment, the risk-reward continuum that we've been talking about. And in the upshot of this will be, if we all as leaders in Chicago from all sectors, government, community, civic, private sector, can point to these transformative projects and recite a few things. We can say, this is what's happened to job creation over the last decade. This is what's happened to how much people pay out of their household income for their housing and transportation costs, because we invested in some things that allowed more people to not have multiple cars because they had access, they have access now to transportation or jobs near where they live that they didn't have before because our sectors are vibrant. And so, these indicators of health, of what makes for a strong region, it is about selecting projects smartly, doing the right ones, and then looking at those impacts and having us all say, yeah, we made some smart decisions and we grew our economy and we saved money for all of us because we're functioning more efficiently.
I completely agree with that. I mean, if you do the math, infrastructure projects seem really expensive, but if you can add 0.2% to economic growth for 5 years, that's like so much larger than the cost of like all the infrastructure you invested in. The problem is you don't know up front that that's going to happen, and so that makes people very skittish. So I completely agree with that, but I will actually go in a slightly different direction, which is, I've been involved in doing big infrastructure projects in big cities all over the country ever since I began doing this work quite a long time ago now. And they are so expensive. And if 20 years from now, a much higher level of involvement in the private sector of not just building projects, but designing them, and since it's their money that's at stake, they are ruthless about figuring out how to achieve the goal for less money, leads us to figuring out how to have not everything cost so much. I think that would be such a gigantic benefit. I mean, if you go to Boston, and Boston is on everyone's minds these days, you go to Boston, Boston is the site of the largest highway project we ever did in America, which was the Big Dig. If you ever were there before, it was this horrible highway, it went right through the middle of the city, and they have put it underground, and there's parks, and it's beautiful. We are never, ever going to do a project like that again, because it costs $14 billion. And no one in their right mind is ever going to do that again, if it's always going to cost $14 billion. And that's like a giant problem. That's a giant problem for cities, because building Walmart out in the middle of a cornfield does not cost $14 billion. Now, building stuff in Chicago is actually probably more economically sensible over the long term. But if the upfront price tag is so gigantic, like we have not figured out how to steel ourselves to be ready to pay those prices. So I'm hopeful that getting private sector creativity into the delivery side can help bend that cost curve.
That's Rita, dream.
I'll just say ditto to what everybody else said. Going back to one of the things that Lois said, we're a world-class city. If you look at any survey, Chicago is always in the top 10, always. Only American cities are New York, Chicago, and sometimes LA. But to stay there, going back to Greece, we have to have a world-class infrastructure. And so I think that's why this is so important. But we have to think big. I was going to first say when you said this, oh, universal broadband access, you know, which is great, but I think 20 years from now it's going to be completely different. So don't stop there. Keep thinking about what's the next thing to keep you on that trajectory of being that world-class city and constantly doing it. And that's why I think, you know, to go back to our favorite person, you have to think big, and that the trust will do that when they consider the project they're going to consider.
That's fantastic. It's a great lead-in for our invitation to you to think big. So, and by the way, we're not just soliciting ideas for projects. This group has been very clear, to my ears at least, about what might be considered a little bit of a watch-ish topic. If you have any questions about how things work, please feel free to ask them as well. Gentleman back here, it was up first.
Yes, thank you. I'm Dave Nutter from Asheville, North Carolina, attending the American Planning Association. With respect to capital financing and the allocation of risk between the payers, the taxpayers, user fees, and private sector equity payments in expectation of profit, and the lenders in the classical sense, the bondholders and others protected by trust, indentures, and similar instruments. Is there any way to think that greater flexibility could be asked of the creditors? And here I'm reflecting Greece a little bit, but it does seem to me that the most rigid of the partners may be the creditors, and there could be a great deal of progress made if they could be more flexible.
Thoughts on this?
I think you raise an excellent point, and I would agree that creditor agreements tend to have pretty strict rules about what we're allowed to do and what we should do. I don't think in the near term we're going to reverse that trend. When you had the banking crisis in 2008, banks took on more rules as opposed to less. The Basel III standards that are descending upon banks are going to change that even further. So I look for vectors in life. Are things generally going in a more positive way or in a more negative way? In terms of the banking sector right now, I think we're seeing the consolidation of capital and power in a fewer number of banks worldwide. As capital becomes the ultimate commodity, and the more of it you have, the more you can do. So I think we're seeing the concentration of banking power, not just in the U.S., but worldwide, and correspondingly a smaller number of players, which gives them more control. And I think the regulatory structures that are out there, which are forcing banks to divest of certain profitable ventures, is forcing them to focus on how the rules are being applied so they can achieve the profitability that their investors want. So I don't think in the near term we'll see the banking world as creditors being flexible. But what I do think we'll see is that the wealth of the world is not held by banks. The wealth of the world is held in pension funds. That is the truth. And pension funds, by virtue of the U.S. tax code, have been completely divorced from infrastructure funding almost forever. And so I think if we're thoughtful about how we introduce public-private partnerships, alternative delivery through the infrastructure trust or the infrastructure exchanges, I think we'll bring the pension world into the investment in our infrastructure for long-term gain. I think that there is a natural nexus between the public pension funds and what we're doing with infrastructure that has never really been tapped. Because all of the tax code says that governments are going to issue tax-exempt debt. Well, a pension fund doesn't pay taxes. It doesn't want a tax-advantaged lower interest rate. So we have purposefully divorced them through our tax code. And I think if we introduce new financing vehicles and the compression of taxable and tax-exempt interest rates, I think we'll begin to see the pension world playing a very different role, as well as the Taft-Hartleys and the labor funds playing a different role. And they will have more flexibility as how they interpret infrastructure projects.
Any other thoughts on
Couldn't have said it better.
I see my friend Barrett from Washington, D.C.
I got a couple of questions for you. It's been a very intriguing conversation. I'm confused about the $7.2 billion. like where that number came from. Is it a reflection of need? Because I think you pretty much said it's not the money you're going to be putting up, and you don't know how much others are going to put up or even what the projects are. Is that number kind of also aspirational?
No, the 7.2 billion is a very real number. Just so we take, for example, our water department. So we're going to be putting in a massive water program. Anybody who lives in the city of Chicago has seen the rebuilding of streets in front of their homes and down the alleys, et cetera. But when the mayor passed his first budget with the city council, part of that was a multi-year increase of water rates that provided the revenue stream to fund a major redevelopment of our water main system and our sewer systems. Our water mains, many of which are over 100 years old, had not been renovated and improved in a long time. But what's fascinating about that from a public policy perspective is that when you tear up a street to put in a water main paid by water revenues, you are basically creating the largest roads program we have had, the largest sidewalks program we have had, and the opportunity to put broadband in, because you're laying pipe. So we used the water program as the cornerstone of a major infrastructure project. We looked at what we're going to be doing with transit and the investments we're making there. We looked at what the investments we're making in schools. So when we aggregate that, that's $7.2 billion, all funded. The $200 million piece is the Chicago infrastructure trust portion. The rest will be financed in conventional ways for part of our long-term capital plans for ongoing needs.
So everything you described is sort of like an efficiency, right? Basically that there's unused capacity or there's inefficiency in how the government currently does things that you might be able to offer up to a private partner to harvest the inefficiency, and that you're either going to give them the savings or they'll split that with you. So one example might be all of your buses on the off-peak run with excess capacity.
Sure.
And that our best bus systems in the country aren't really doing a lot to bring riders in to use that off-peak capacity. So could you offer to a private partner, you do whatever you need to do, probably with smartphones and advertising and co-marketing with retailers to increase the off-peak ridership, and you can have half of the revenue that would come in through the fare box. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
It sounds like a fascinating idea. I haven't really thought about it that way, but come on down to the trust. We have a great conversation. I think it's not just about only efficiency, but about creativity. I think that's the other piece that the trust will really be a hallmark of. What are different ways of attracting investors? What are different projects that we would otherwise be looking at? Because in the world of government, we're working with shrinking resources, as you know well. We just don't have as many people looking at the issues, and so we need to make sure that we're opening our minds to other ideas from all parts of our community to come forward with ideas, not just what we can develop inside City Hall.
And to extend your example, Harriet, it could be a more efficient way to use off-peak seats on a public transit vehicle. It could be advertising revenue. It could be split shift workers. A whole variety of things that are more difficult for the public sector to do within our existing structures. But throwing that open.
But it's interesting because government, a core function isn't marketing. So we don't have the CTA creating an alliance with Blue Cross Blue Shield to take their employees, from a bus stop to the headquarters. We don't see that because we in government don't think that way. That's not wrong. We're not wrong for doing it, but it's a different mindset. And so there are some things that we each do differently. And so we pull that together. Maybe we've got different ideas and different answers when we come up with the past.
All right, sir.
I was wondering how projects are decided to be in the infrastructure trust versus government. So, for example, we got a starting bus rapid transit. Is that something where the commissioner would go and say, gee, I have this and I really want to expand it 100-fold in the next 5 years, and I can't do it? Or another example, we're talking about high-speed rail, about developing that multimodal hub someplace. That's something where, gee, it's in the central area plan, but who knows what will ever happen. And then I've asked the CTA to have off-peak fares for years, especially for seniors when they went from free to charging us. So I'm just sort of curious of the process of something that wants to get done by government. Are you talking to them and you go to the commissioner and you say, tell me something you really love to do and you really just can't do it now and look at it, or?
So it is a porous process, so I think it can come in from a variety of directions, lots of conduit. The plans that we were talking about before, as an expression of city priorities, is one place that you can find a list of needs, but these evolve over time, and there are better ideas out there every day. So it's not limited to the plans. In the case of bus rapid transit, which is an issue that we've had involvement with the city and with other stakeholders, I think it has something to do with timetable and funding sources that are traditional versus whether you have the latitude to give the oxygen to this kind of experimental structure. So that there will be, I think, a very positive relationship between the mayor's cabinet and the city agencies and the infrastructure trust. Lois is right in the middle of that to facilitate the flow of ideas and evaluation. The city of Chicago is looking at a first segment for gold standard bus rapid transit, and if they had the time to look at innovative infrastructure for the first segment, then that would be a decent candidate. There's a deadline coming up soon for federal fundings that might compress that and make that more difficult. But future segments could come, again, with the aggregation of the scale of not just one initial segment, but multiple routes, and it would be evaluated to see what sort of creative ideas come up.
Matt, thank you.
Pretty soon we're going to have over 50 empty schools in Chicago. Is any thought being given into reuse of those for companies? Or, now, a lot of them would probably cost a lot to remodel or redo. Are there companies that would like a nice big building to put offices into?
I think that's an area of exploration that we should absolutely be tapping into. I know that the education team is certainly looking at the adaptive reuse of the buildings that they have. Certainly keeping them safe is our number one priority, and then trying to figure out what we do with them. But it is, to the extent that there are opportunities, that would be something the trust could look at it, transformational in different ways that could be looked at.
Okay, I see, now we're starting to get a lot of hands. Let's go all the way to the back and start on the left and keep it moving.
I'll try to project as best I can.
Not far left than I thought, but okay.
I work in a regional government agency in California where we are now doing a lot of planning based on performance measures. And our projects, we have to measure all of our projects against a certain set of performance measures to prioritize them. And I'm wondering, one of those performance measures is social equity. And I'm wondering what the role is of the trust in terms of balancing needs and also making sure that certain populations are not left out of the project list.
I'll start that question because that was a question that came up at City Council. The infrastructure trust is not going to answer the social justice needs of any city. I think while the trust will be sensitive to the implications, we also have to recognize it's a small part of a very big picture. And so we want to make sure that it is successful and that we can create models to go forward. But there are ideas that people have explored for the trust about low-income housing, adaptive reuse of vacant land, how we use that kind of stuff. So I think it's possible, but I don't think we should expect the trust to solve the social justice issues or equity issues in any community.
Let's take a couple more from the back, the far left in the back and then the far right.
My question is more general about decrease. How does the panel feel that for smaller regions, slow growth regions, the tool will be applied? Will some of the regions of the country be kind of left out of this mechanism? Because I see Congress has already abandoned the idea of kind of taking the whole country with each other to go forward. Because we're seeing less and less funding, less and less action from them to make sure that we have the investments into our infrastructure. So with this mechanism, are we going to see the whole country keep moving forward, or is it going to be the major population centers that already have?
Right, so this is a topic that we've been talking about at the American Planning Association meetings, and the expression 1% cities has come up, the cities of the 1%. So is there applicability here to the slow-growing and less dynamic parts of the country?
In theory, yes, but you have to deal with a couple of practicalities. One of which is transaction costs are significant. You're talking about a lot of hours by a lot of, high-priced people to do a good deal. So a $2 million deal can't cover that. So there's a minimum size. The minimum size will be different depending on what the deal is and different in different states, but that's a reality. The second thing is if the benefit from having the private sector involved that you are seeking is deliver services or products with greater efficiency or for a lesser cost, you can do that anywhere. If what the deal you're making with the private sector is, I'm going to let you take over this function, you get all the upside, they're going to look for a situation where there's a lot of potential upside, which means growth of some kind. Growth in the usage of facility, growth in the economy of that place, growth in the number of travelers or users or riders or ratepayers or whatever they are. So in the situation where you're essentially selling future upside, that's probably going to be in places that are faster growing. In situations where you're buying their ability to lower costs, that's probably not necessarily tilted towards high growth places.
I think that's a really fascinating question. I was born and raised in a very small town in upstate New York. And so I'm always kind of, my small town roots always come through, and I hear questions like that because I worried about that for most of my childhood. I actually think that new models will be the savior of a lot of smaller communities. I take a look at water systems. It is virtually impossible for a small water system to have the level of engineering, disaster preparedness, for planning for terrorist events. It's almost impossible to have the resident expertise that you require in this day and age only in a small system. So if you were to partner with private parties who might manage 100, 1,000 water systems, you tap into the world's best expertise, protect your citizenry, and actually do a better job for your community. But I also reflect, both my parents were small town elected officials. I know that mindset. And change comes hard to all of us. Some of us are living in big cities where we swim in a sea of ideas. Small town America is not that same way. So there's a different level of education and cultivation of new ideas that's required for that environment. But I don't know if it was Roy or MarySue or Rita that said something about process can address a lot of the uncertainty and the fears of trying something new and different. And if there is a national discussion about what the process is and what the language is and how to do it, it makes it that much more accessible to smaller communities who are concerned about the very same issues, just on a different scale. It also enables small communities to aggregate and connect with each other to get some of that scale. So I think that there might be terrific opportunities for small communities if they're willing to be creative and think outside the box.
Okay, let's go to the back right.
Hi, Ben Brockman of the Infrastructure Council of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce. And I want to thank the gentleman before me, because that kind of goes into my question, or I guess more thought, which is each region, the trust that we discussed, and as you discussed today, isn't going to work everywhere. And what I've heard is almost a conflicting message where Roy mentioned there's many different definitions of what an infrastructure trust is, what an infrastructure bank is. And then I think to the Hoover Dam being a public-private partnership, we almost have conflicting messages there. If what we think of as a trust is different in so many different situations, and we're operating today in an area where when you talk about privatization of anything, I can't imagine the Hoover Dam coming out as a public-private partnership today, just looking at some of the examples we've seen on the cynical side here in northeast Illinois with the parking meters and the Skyway, but also as you look at things such as privatization of Amtrak and some of these different things. My question to you is, how do you go forward in this age where there are so many different solutions and almost too many options for different municipalities of all sizes to handle? And how do you convey that Chicago Infrastructure Trust is different? And again, this is some of that local cynicism coming in. that this is something we can trust, and it is different than what might have failed before, or what might be talked about on the federal level, where they're struggling to, they're saying they want to put money in infrastructure, they're saying they want these creative ideas, and then they are absolutely dragging their feet, not even close to the door to start that conversation. So how do you approach this and inform people, other than just going out and saying, well, you get 0.2% growth. 0.2% growth, I spend most of my time trying to tell people, here's the benefit to your local area, but these examples that we come up with, I think most of us in this room are in the know, which is why we're here. And it makes sense to us, but how do you convey this to John and Jane and go public that this is different, this is going to work, here's how this works, and here's why maybe some of that private side of the P3 isn't such a bad thing after all.
Sounds like you're going to need some successful projects. But,
I would say two things. One of which is the thing, show me, don't tell me. You can go tell everyone how great it is till you're blue in the face. Do a project that they like will speak far more persuasively than anything that you say. So what that means is, you only have one chance to make a first impression. The first set of things that the trust does will set precedent. It will establish expectations. And that's probably more powerful. And the second thing is what you said, which is it's not about hearing from the private sector about what they want and then doing it. It's what do we want? If you do projects that people want and you got them done as opposed to doing what they expect, which is they never frickin' get done, then you've done something. But, that's hard.
Which for the Chicago Trust, the question I would then ask is if we're trying to gain the public's trust, why are we going with vertical structures, whereas we don't have a direct line from O'Hare Airport to Midway Airport that can get you downtown in 30 minutes or less? It's just that there are so many more visible things that I can see from my perspective and from the business side to keep the competitiveness, to keep the facilities and businesses moving here that would do that. I completely agree with you. It should be show me, not tell me, but I think that that's something where it really is those first few projects are key.
Can I talk about the show me, don't tell me? Because I think sometimes we love to look at the negative things and the negative experiences, but we forget the really extraordinary positive experiences. So in Chicago, the first public-private partnership was not meters, it was not Skyway. It was the Chicago Bus Shelter Agreement with JC&Co, where there are 2,200 bus shelters installed 100% with private dollars, for which the city this year will be paid $17.5 million. Do you know how many phone calls I get that the bus shelter is, dirty? None. Do you know how many calls I get that there's inappropriate ads being played in them? None. So we forget and we just take for granted success and we focus on the negative and the problems. Despite the challenges of meters and the meters transaction, the average time to get a meter repaired prior to the transaction was approximately 2 weeks. After the transaction happened, anybody have a guess? 45 minutes. So, and that is not just because it's lining the pockets of the private sector, but because we have an operating agreement that demands that they have to meet certain standards. So I have, as a government administrator, far greater control over the accountability to you as taxpayers through those agreements than I have by calling my colleagues in city departments and saying, that bus shelter down on 63rd and Vincennes, it needs to get fixed. Like, yeah, we'll get to that. So I think we need to begin as a community not just focusing on the negative, but thinking about what's the positive and how do we build on it. And I think, Skyway, same example. We do not have, we tried to get electronic tolling on the Skyway for years. That was a bankrupt asset. It was bankrupt, physically bankrupt. And we, got electronic tolling on there within 3 months of the contract being inked. So we forget about some of the successes. And in one area that the public-private partnership model has done extremely well is in defining what we can expect of our infrastructure in black and white and who we can hold accountable for it. Because we don't do that today. I don't have standards we have goals, but no accountability if we don't reach the goals. So I think that has turned it on its head. I think we really ought to open our minds about what have been the wins and where have we gone wrong, and focus on how do we gain the account, improve upon the accountability, improve upon the disclosure. I mean, the trust is doing, when MarySue goes to a meeting, it is a room not quite this big, but close, and the reporters are there, and everything's a full discussion, and they're fully baked. The same presentations that she gets are what the public gets. So we're trying to move forward through the areas where we've had concern and really build on our success. And so I think we need to focus on those elements.
Your question emphasizes, and I think you're concurring, Lois, about the importance of sophisticated communication mechanisms. It's both transparency at meetings, but also a lot more. It's also important to recognize that there's two big categories of projects that might emerge from the infrastructure trust. One are savings efficiency, which the Retrofit Chicago represents, and the other is, to Roy's point, these are the things that we need, we want, we've decided is important to invest in, and help us figure out a good way to pay for that, a smart way to pay for that. So there will be both, and the nuances of communicating that this is a great deal for both lowering our costs and enhancing a benefit that we don't have today are different kinds of strategies, and will require some communications efforts, no question.
Okay, I've been given a signal that maybe one more. Sir, if you would.
Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I had a question regarding the response to the woman's comment back earlier about social ills and your ability to solve them or address them. I feel that one of your aspirations should be social equity in the sense that if you can somehow allow the private sector to invest, make a real-time benefit or turn a profit on this, that you would be able to keep under control gentrification issues pertaining to affordability in the communities. It seems that more than anything would have, I can understand maybe it not being a direct benefit of it, but down the road, that would be a feasible solution to controlling, or keeping under control the affordability issue while still putting in place infrastructure projects that have real benefit to the community that they're in.
I thank you for that comment. I think that the most important thing we can do for social equity is to strengthen the economy overall and protect the economy. Because if our economy weakens, then the people that get hurt the worst are the lowest end of the spectrum, not the top. So by virtue of investing in an infrastructure, we get our best chance of helping all segments of our community grow. And I think that's really part of the underlying premise as well.
I think it's time to thank our panel for not only being knowledgeable,